By the way, I want to hear from you. If you're a fan of this show, if you're listening to it for the first time, let me know how you found the show. Let me know what you think of the show. I am 100% on board for any constructive criticism you may offer. If you would like to be a guest, if you know somebody who would like to be a guest, please reach out. You can go old school. You can email me, detoxpod@gmail.com. You can slide into my DMs on Instagram. Hit me up in the comment section if you are listening to this in a place where there are comments. But I love feedback and I would love to know what you think of this podcast and whether you would like to be on. Are you a member of the ethically non monogamous community and are you looking for community wherever you are? If you are and you're interested in traveling to New England, I say check out Camp Constellation that is running from August 30th through September 3rd, 2025. You can find out more at www.enmne.com. That is Ethical Non-Monogamy New England, enmne.com. Camp Constellation is an all-inclusive co-created event hosted by ENMNE where ethically non-monogamous folk come together at a summer camp in Maine to learn, grow, connect, and have fun in a safe, supportive environment. If you're interested, I suggest you check it out. Each episode of the Detoxicity podcast begins with the sound of someone else's voice. Actually, that's a lie. Each episode of Detoxicity begins with my voice because there's an intro and a bumper and all that other stuff. But once you get into the meat of the episode, I like to have the guest kick them off by talking a little bit about who they are and why they're here. So, for this episode, I'm going to be the person that kicks it off officially or unofficially, or I don't know, whatever. Anyway, hey everybody, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the creator, the host, and the producer of the Detoxicity podcast. Back in March, we celebrated our 5th anniversary, and now, just a few short months later, we have recorded and released episode number 200. A lot of podcasts don't last very long, so I'm going to pat myself on the back and congratulate myself for not only 5 years of fairly consistent podcasting, but 200 episodes of what I believe is really meaningful content. So what I did for this episode, it's not a typical Detoxicity episode where I talk to someone and it's an interview. I reached out to a bunch of friends and supporters of the podcast via email, via Instagram, and asked them to submit questions to me. Questions pertinent to the topic of the podcast, which is masculinity and how we live it, how we adapt as we grow, all that stuff. And I basically said, submit questions and I will answer them. If you've ever had any burning question about me or the podcast or why I started it or why I continue to do it, I was like, send them all in. And I got a pretty decent response. I got a bunch of questions. I have listened to some of them in advance, not all of them. And I will say that those of you who've responded that I've listened to brought your A game. You asked some very thoughtful questions, and I am super excited to sit down and answer them for you. Hope you enjoy this episode. If you don't, we'll be back to our regular format with the next episode. So you've got that going for you. Thank you for listening. And I really appreciate everybody who has been a part of this journey over the past 5 years, whether you've been a guest, whether you've listened to one episode, whether you've listened to all of the episodes, although I doubt anyone has listened to all 200 episodes yet, because that feels like a really heavy lift. But if you have, kudos to you. Email me, give me a shout out. I would love to hear from you if you have listened to every single one of these episodes. I'm not sure if I've listened to every single one of these episodes. So, again, kudos to you. Anyway, moving on to the questions. Let's get started.
Hey Mike, your buddy T-Gop here, aka Callahan Gobble, aka episode 139. First, congrats on 200 episodes. I know how much work pods can be, and sometimes it feels like yelling into the void. But detoxicity is so important, and I know it's been important to so many folks, especially in this recent resurgence of toxic masculinity. For me personally, listening to the pod has been influential in coming to terms with my own identity as a queer man in a straight relationship. I first came out on your pod, and our personal friendship has been so helpful in settling into my identity. So thank you for that. Anyway, my question. What advice do you have for men who pass for straight but are realizing they are queer? And also, what do you think is the significance of them coming out, both personally and culturally? Again, congrats on 200. Stoked for 200 more. Thanks for all that you do, buddy.
Thank you, Callahan. If you missed that, that was episode number 139. I strongly urge you to go back and check that out if you haven't listened to it yet. First of all, thank you for the compliments and thank you for submitting a question. You were one of the more unflinchingly honest people to come on the show, and your story is really interesting and really important. And I would love to have you back. I know we've talked about it a few times. We should make that happen. Anyway, to get to your questions, advice for queer men who pass as straight. I would say be yourself. And in order to be yourself, I guess you got to figure out who and what that is. I think that there can be pressure to make yourself more stereotypically queer in order to signal or in order to fit in with your newfound queer community. I think there's value in that, but I also think there are some people who do that and lose who they are in the process. And I don't want anybody to lose the fundamental themness of who they are, right? So it's complicated, as are most things. But if you pass, continue to be yourself. But I would also say you have the ability as a straight passing human, particularly as a straight passing human in a heteronormative primary relationship, to be louder about your queerness to people who are not on board with the spectrum of queerness, right? Like you can speak for people in rooms where people who maybe offer a more stereotypical representation of queerness will not be allowed to speak or won't be heard as well. So I would say use your privilege for good, basically. In terms of the significance of coming out, personally, look, there is a ton of freedom in being your true self. I think back to when I was in the closet or half in the closet or situationally in the closet, which kind of went up and down for many, many years. And now it's like, okay, I'm not hiding anything from anybody. And there is such a huge relief and freedom in that, I'm not ashamed of anything. I'm not having to manufacture stories in my head or keep my story straight or anything like that. It's just such a mental relief. So personally, I would say as long as it's safe for you to do so. And I do think that some people manufacture unsafety, I guess. You got to push yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit and put yourself in situations that might not be comfortable for you, certainly might not be comfortable for other people. But I think part of the cost of freedom is that you're going to be uncomfortable exhibiting that freedom sometimes. So I would say come out in any place where it's safe for you. You don't necessarily have to be out in the workplace. You don't need to walk down the street wearing a rainbow pin or anything like that. But I do think you should be out to people that matter the most to you, at least as a start. From a cultural perspective, I think there again is value in offering varied versions of queerness. No disrespect to anybody, but I think we're still very much in like a Will and Grace drag race kind of stereotypical flamboyant queerness, leaning in on stereotypes. And stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason, I get it. But the reality is that queerness, like blackness, like maleness, like womanhood, is such like a varied and individual thing, and it always helps to have different representations of what these things are. So if you are a queer person with blue hair, if you're a queer person that does drag, and if you're a queer person that doesn't do either of those things, and you're just a queer person who lives your life and is a regular, degular person, those are all equally valid representations of queerness. And again, I think it's super helpful to have a big tapestry of of the various definitions of what these cultural markers can mean. So I think it's huge from a cultural perspective to have queer people that everybody can relate to. I think that's important. And again, be yourself. If you're not that person, then you're not that person. Don't be that person. But if you are that person, use the power and the privilege you have for good. Hopefully, that's not too long winded an answer and it makes sense. Thanks, Callahan, for your question.
Hi, Mike. Happy 200th episode. This is two-time Detoxicity guest Josh Gondelman calling in, writing in, voice noting in with a question. I want to know, what is something that you found over the course of 200 episodes to be unexpectedly like common or relatable between guests? Like, what's something that keeps coming up that you didn't necessarily expect would be common to so many different kinds of guests, but with different perspectives and backgrounds, but you hear coming up over and over again? And that could be, something positive, like a lesson or a processing or coping strategy, or something negative, like something a lot of people are struggling with that maybe you or even they didn't realize was so widespread. All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you, two-time guest Josh Gondelman. Everybody, I'm going to plug right now. Make sure you check out Josh's comedy special, Positive Reinforcement, which will be premiering on YouTube at the end of this month. And now that I've got the salesy stuff out of the way, first of all, thank you, Josh, for submitting a question. Second, thank you for being on the show not once, but twice. Third, to answer your question, this one actually I'm having a little bit of trouble with. Something unexpected that I've found common amongst all our guests. There are definitely commonalities, most of which I kind of figured would be the case because they're the same reasons I started the podcast, even though the popular conception is that men are heard all the time. I think a lot of men are struggling to be heard, particularly in this environment. And maybe some of us are resorting to not ideal means in which to be heard. People are lashing out, and we're 100% anti lashing out on this podcast, just to make sure y'all know that. Another thing I think that I find common is that even amongst the most confident of our guests, there is still a desire to practice vulnerability. And I don't know if any of my guests, even the ones that do this kind of work professionally, have gotten all the way there in their search. I think everybody's looking for permission to perform a type of masculinity that's maybe a little bit different. In some cases, a lot different, but I think in most of our guest cases, a little bit different, a little bit more progressive, a little bit more inward focusing than what they're currently practicing. Everybody's looking to take the next step forward. And I think that's the one commonality that maybe is a little bit unexpected. We're all still, in some fashion, struggling to get to that next step, but we all do want to get to that next step, which I think is super important. Anyway, thanks, Josh, for the question. If you ever want to do a third round on the show, give me a shout.
All right, so boom. You're a hip hop guy. You're a New York guy. I'd like to know how New York hip hop has impacted, informed, or shaped your masculinity, for positive or for negative.
First of all, that is Kevin Patterson, who has been on the Detoxicity podcast 4 times. I believe he shares the record for most times appearing on the show with Dylan Thomas, and he and Dylan have actually appeared on shows together a couple of times. Kevin is a wonderful expert and author and speaker. He runs the site Poly Role Models. He has an amazing book called Love's Not Colorblind, which I think all of you should read, and is just a great wealth of knowledge, even temper, logic. I have certainly looked to him a few times in the past when I've needed like a logical answer to a question. I appreciate Kevin so much. And I also love the way he just, in a very almost New York way, came in, asked the question, got out. Like very to the point and blunt, and that's the way that goes. And that actually sort of answers the question a little bit. New York hip hop is super important to me. I am of an era when hip hop was really just starting to blossom into an art form. And while I'm not old enough to have caught the park jams and all that stuff, I'm kind of second generation in that I remember the mix shows on the radio. I remember everybody saying rap was a fad. I remember rap records not being on pop radio stations or even R&B radio stations a lot of times. So I still remember the days when it was pretty much an underground thing. And I think that it has shaped my masculinity in ways that affect my confidence. I think Jay-Z famously called hip hop, or his music anyway, he called it black superhero music, right? And I think there is an element of hip hop that really speaks to men, black men, men of color in particular, where it gives them that extra like pep in their step when the world is pushing you down, right? And this country notoriously treats black men and brown men like shit. That music, those voices, you hear Jay's voice or Nas's voice or Rakim's voice or Kane's voice or KRS's voice, Prodigy's voice, and you feel empowered. You feel extra confident. And even to take it out of New York, you hear Kendrick's voice. You feel confident. So when you go into that job interview, when you're walking into that boardroom, when you are facing the day, when you're going out into the world, hip hop, more than any other type of music, is what gives me pep in my step. It what gives me confidence, what makes me feel worthy in a lot of ways. And in some ways, hip hop is kind of, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to use my words properly in this case. There's a lot of hip hop today, and there's been a lot of hip hop in the past that has been misogynist and homophobic, and there's been certainly some well-intentioned misinformation given. Like I think about a lot of the 5% stuff that I grew up listening to, and I'm now fortunately at an age and at a level of knowing the world that I can say that I'm past all of that, but I do think that some of the music I listened to informed me in some negative ways as a young person that maybe was not as worldly. And again, thankfully, I grew out of that. And I think that in some cases, the artists that made that stuff grew out of it as well. And I hope that everybody from that era kind of realizes how well intentioned but misguided some of the messages may have been, but I know that that's not the case. For me, it has been certainly much more of a positive influence than a negative influence. I'm grateful to hip hop. If I bleed anything, I bleed New York hip hop from like 1987 to like 1995, 1996. That is like my pocket. And I'm greatly appreciative of the artists and writers and producers who made that music happen. So there you go. Thank you, Kevin. Let's make it number five.
Hey, Mike, it's Zach. As a loyal listener of Detoxicity, I want to say that pretty much without fail, when I listen to the show, I find myself thinking about not just my in the moment understandings of masculinity, but frequently I find myself thinking about that historically. My understandings of masculinity over the years, where it came from, how it evolved, etc. And so, my question for you, as the host, producer, and curator of Detoxicity, is as you interact with all of your guests and these just super compelling stories they tell, how have your guests shaped, reshaped, challenged your own understanding of masculinity over these last 200 episodes? Thanks so much, Mike. Love the show. Love you. Congrats on 200 episodes. Can't wait to hear more.
So here we get the first person to submit a question that has not been a previous guest on the podcast. Dr. Zach Stigler, my good friend, thank you for the wonderful compliments. Happy belated birthday. And thank you very much for submitting a question. And thank you for listening to the show. And thank you. It's a love fest right now. Thank you for being such a great supporter, not only because of this podcast, but through the last 15 or so years that we've known each other. To answer your question, I've said to other people, and I think I may have even said it on episodes of the pod itself. Yes, there's a part of me that does this so other people can hear stories and gain empathy and knowledge or get something out of it. But the main reason I do this podcast is for me. Every time I speak to somebody, I learn something. I don't know that there is a single episode that I've recorded for this podcast, and this includes the ones that I haven't published for whatever reason, where I haven't come away with a different way of thinking about a thing. I learn from everybody that I encounter, whether it's learning something about somebody else, learning something about myself through somebody else, or learning something about humankind, people in general, particularly because these conversations can be so vulnerable in a way that everyday conversation is usually not. The thing that I've come away with the most is that I am continuously shaped and reshaped and challenged. These conversations always, someone will always say something that'll make me be like, oh, that's different. Maybe I should consider that. And to me, that is the beauty of this. And that's why I've kept doing it for so long, because it just keeps my brain active and keeps me growing. And one thing I think you should never endeavor to do as a human is to stop growing. We are all evolving beings, and doing this is like evolving in real time in practice. You know what I'm saying? So, once again, thank you, Zach, for the question. Thank you for listening, and keep listening. I hope that you keep getting stuff out of it the way that I do.
Hello, Mike, my friend. This is Greg Flynn, coach and facilitator and guy who is interested in making some small dent in the lives of men in this world, and a fan of the DetoxPod and its host, Mike. So I have, well, first of all, congratulations on getting a 200 episodes to 5 years of the pod. That is no small feat, my friend. And yeah, I have a couple questions for you. And I'll just put some pausing in here just in case you want to do some editing. So, all right. So here's the first kind of set of questions. If you could have anyone, living or dead, on the pod, who would that be and why? And what question would you have for them? What question would you want to dig in deep with them on? And then here's my second question. What is your advice for getting a podcast to 5 years and 200 episodes? Like I said, no small feat, and something I wasn't able to do. So I'd love to hear what your advice is, my friend. Congrats again, and looking forward to that 200th episode.
Hey, I got a twofer. Thank you, Greg Flynn, for contributing multiple questions to episode 200, and now I have to answer them. Also, thank you for the work that you do for men. Just an amazing coach and guide and facilitator. So I want to give you some flowers there. Living or dead. So I don't have a written dream list, but I have a dream list kind of in my head, and it fluctuates from time to time. But there is a short list of people that would be amazing gets for me on the podcast. And that list, my number one on my list is Barack Obama. If Barack Obama ever did this podcast, I would faint. He is just an amazingly interesting, intelligent person that I think would actually have really thoughtful things to say about masculinity, his own and that of other people. I would love to have him on the show. Nick Offerman is someone I would love to have on the show. Will Smith. And I got to separate there because I actually have a friend whose name is Will Smith. I'm talking about, and actually, I would love to have my friend Will on the show as well. But Will Smith, the actor and musician, I would love to have on the show. Steve Burns, Steve from Blues Clues, who I think is the closest thing we have now to like a modern day Mr. Rogers or Jim Henson type character. I would love to have him on the show. There is a long, long list of musicians, actors, writers, athletes, sort of pop culture figures. Pete Buttigieg, I would love to have on the show. There's just such a long list of people. Jumaane Williams, who is a major politician here in New York. I would love to have my dad on the show. That would be a great one. And I would also love to have someone who has known me for the majority of my life to be on the show. The closest thing I had to that very early on in the podcast, I had Neil Taff on the podcast, and Neil I met when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And unfortunately, Neil has passed on, but that is the closest thing to a childhood, someone who has known me my entire life. I would love to have somebody I went to high school with be on the podcast. And we're going to come close to that in the next couple of episodes, so look out for that. And as far as questions, I don't know. I tailor each question to the guest that I have, and having these particular people that I listed off on the podcast feels like such a pipe dream. I haven't even jumped to the point where I would think about questions to ask them. Actually, here's a controversial one. I would love to have Louis C.K. on this podcast, just to be 100% blunt and just kind of be like, why? Why did you do the shit that you did, and see what he ends up saying? So I don't know. Again, I have a long list. It's hundreds of people long, probably, and I could probably spend the rest of this show naming off people that I would love to have on. In addition to the people that I would love to have back, there are so many people that have been on the show once that I would love to have back a second time. Whether it's for follow up and how have you been since the time that I interviewed you, or there are questions that I left off the first time I spoke to you, and I want to hit that second wave now that I get to talk to you again. Also, I would love to have somebody that I've dated on the podcast. That the only person that I have gone out with that has been on the podcast was Louis Pearlman, and that was also very early on. So I would love to have somebody that I've gone out with be on the podcast. So if any of you that have dated me are listening, give me a shout. You know where to find me. For your second question, advice for having a podcast run for 5 years and or 200 episodes. So as I'm recording this, Mark Maron, actor, comedian, also somebody that would love to have on this podcast, just announced that he is retiring his WTF podcast after 16 years. And I feel like this question would be better suited for him. I enjoy doing this. I wouldn't do it if I didn't like it. And the second part of that, in addition to enjoying what I do, and like I mentioned in my comment to Zach, feeling like I learn something every time I talk to somebody, is the fact that y'all respond to it. I am the type of person who loves positive reinforcement. So if I put something out in the world and someone says, hey, this made me think differently about X thing, or I really enjoyed this conversation, or hey, you're doing a great job, that's going to incentivize me to do it again, do it better, do it more. So it's a combination of really being energized by my guests, loving what I do, and getting positive reinforcement from the people that listen to the podcast. Thank you, Greg, for your two questions, and thank you for doing what you do. I appreciate you so much and would love to have you back.
Dude, 200 episodes is a massive milestone. Congratulations. Thanks for making a safe place for challenging conversations about real shit. My question, man, is I'm going to give you two. You pick your favorite or use both. What's your key takeaway? What's the lesson learned, the greatest lesson learned over 200 eps, if you had to boil it down? And my other question, my other question is then, what was one of your most moving or meaningful experiences or epiphanies that happened, live or during an interview, as it were? Congrats, my brother. And thanks again. And bet your ass will be hollering at you if and when I pop up there again soon. Feel better. Peace.
All right, so that was two-time Detoxicity guest Benjamin Wagner. Ben is doing wonderful things. I hope I can say this, or maybe because I don't know if I can say it, I'm not going to say it. Something very cool has just happened to Benjamin, and we'll let him talk about it the next time he's on the pod. Anyway, two questions he asked, and I'm going to answer the second one first. There have been lots of emotional moments for me over the course of the pod, And there are two that I am thinking of very specifically that were super, super moving. One was the episode I did with Jason Green, where he really talked about his struggles with gender, and the reason it was so affecting to me is because it was completely unexpected. I generally have an idea of how these conversations are going to go. I don't get thrown too many curveballs, but this particular conversation it took a hard left, right? And he was way more open, probably isn't the right word, vulnerable than I was expecting him to be. So that was definitely a very surprising, emotionally affecting part or conversation that took place over the course of the show. The other one I can think of is episode 124 with Xander Masser. Xander is the brother of my good friend Graham. He is an author and he wrote a book or put together a book consisting of photographs that his father took. His father was a photographer who ultimately passed away from AIDS related complications. The way that he talked about his dad and the experience of being with him and his passing actually, I think, is the only time that I've actually teared up during a conversation for the show. So that answers the second question. First question is actually similar to a question that was asked earlier, which is what is the common thread that I've seen across 200 episodes? And there are a couple, right? And I'm recording this answer on a different day than I recorded the previous answer, so maybe they'll be a little bit different. Everybody's looking for community, right? Everybody's looking for people. Whether we consciously know that or not, we are all looking for people that we can walk this road of life with. We all need help. Again, not something we all realize, definitely not something that we're all comfortable with asking for. I'm not even sure sometimes if I'm comfortable asking for it, but we all need help. We all need each other, and we're all hurt in some way. Like somewhere over the course of our lives, somebody fucked with us, and we haven't fully gotten over that. Another thing I would say is that all of the people that I've spoken to are really trying to become the best version of themselves that they can possibly be. There have been a couple of episodes where I've kind of felt like, this feels a little salesy or this feels kind of put on, and I have actually not published those episodes. There's probably over the course of the last 5 years, I would say 10 or 12 conversations I've had where I've reviewed the interview and I've been like, you know what? This isn't feeling great. I'm going to let this sit. And honestly, there are a couple of episodes that I felt that way about that I've ended up publishing anyway, because I guess I don't always trust my instincts. But there are a whole bunch of common threads throughout all the episodes of the podcast. And I'd be curious, as someone who is very, very close to this, I'd be curious to talk to somebody who maybe doesn't, is not the host, right? Is not the host, is not the creator, is not the editor, who has maybe a little bit of distance and ask them what they feel the common thread is. So if any of you out there have listened to a lot of episodes or all of the episodes or most of the episodes, you tell me what do you think the common thread is besides masculinity being the overall arching thread. Thank you, Ben, for your questions. I can't wait to talk to you on or off air, but also on air so we can talk about your next thing.
Hey, Mike, it's Jake Slichter. Here's my question. In the world of film, what are your favorite examples of non-toxic male behavior?
First of all, thank you, Jake Slichter, for the question. Secondly, whew, this is maybe the hardest question that I've gotten so far. I for two reasons. One is I am not a super cinephile. I've seen lots of movies over the course of my life, but I know plenty of people who are deep into film, and I am not that, right? I've got music. I can't really balance film the same way. I can't balance two things that I'm completely obsessed about. Actually, that's false because I've got music and basketball. Either way, I am much less well versed about film than I am about music. So it's a difficult question from that perspective. It's also a difficult question because it's really hard for me to think of film characters that are male film characters that are not toxic. Like I'm thinking about all of the movie characters I grew up watching, or all of the characters from movies that I grew up watching during the 80s and 90s. And, you know, Prince Akeem from Coming to America was not toxic. Marty McFly was not toxic, but I also feel like kind of everybody else was. Flip your question a little bit. The characters that resonate with me most from films are the characters that had toxic elements, but either got their comeuppance in maybe a more gentle kind of way and sort of turned themselves around a bit. I'm actually thinking of Jonah Hill's character in Superbad, who maybe was toxic, but was also, if there is a way that someone can be innocently toxic, was kind of innocently toxic and then kind of turned things around a little bit. Or I don't know. I don't know if I'm explaining myself properly, but that's kind of what I'm thinking of. Now, I'm actually probably better with TV characters than I am with movie characters. And I mean, obviously now there are entire shows about men who are not toxic, but I think of Theo Huxtable, right? Non-toxic. And also not drawn as a caricature the way that maybe somebody like Steve Urkel was. Will Smith, not a toxic character, and also not drawn as a caricature like his cousin Carlton was. Jacob Hill on Abbott Elementary, very deliberately non toxic. Gregory Eddy, also from Abbott Elementary, maybe less deliberately non toxic, but still non toxic. It's funny how so many of my examples of non toxic male behavior are coming from sitcoms. T'Challa, obviously drawn to be non-toxic, but clearly non-toxic. Going back to television, Donald Faison's character on Scrubs, vaguely toxic in certain ways, but again, like the Jonah Hill example I gave before, a very unintentional, mild level of toxicity. Also, I would love to have Donald Faison on this podcast, and I'm only like 1 degree of separation. Let's make that happen. But there are plenty of examples out there. I'm actually thinking of the movie that I most recently saw, which was Sinners. Actually, that's also not the movie that I most recently saw. It's the movie I most recently saw in the theater. And I'm not thinking of anybody from that movie being non-toxic, but also it's a zombie movie. So everybody, it's a zombie movie, and it's also a zombie movie that's a period piece that was set in a period where black people had, a century and a half already of learned toxicity from their enslavers to that they were working through. Anyway, that was my long-winded answer to your question, Jacob. I hope you and the listeners can make sense of that. Go see Sinners.
Hey, Mike, this is Andrew Grossman. In addition to considering you a dear friend, I was an early guest on your podcast and have been a devoted listener ever since. I don't think I've missed an episode. So I'm calling to congratulate you on your 200th episode and to contribute a question. So here it is. If you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice at the start of this podcast journey, what would it be? And how do you think it would have shaped the show?
So I actually had to go back and figure out which episode Andrew Grossman was even on. I thought it was much earlier than it was. It was episode 27. Go back and listen to that one if you want to hear an early episode of the pod. But thank you, Andrew. You are one of my favorite people, one of my best friends, and actually one of the inspirations for this podcast itself. I'm not sure if I've told this story before, but a good chunk of the inspiration for this podcast came from a men's group that I started but ended up not really being a part of. And the reason for that is because right around the time me and Andrew and some other friends decided to put together this men's group and we figured out a place and a time to meet. I was also in the process of forming a basketball league, which ended up meeting on the same day at the same time. And obviously, I can't be two places at once. That technology has not been developed yet. So I ended up choosing, for the most part, basketball. I did show up to a couple of men's group meetings, but and I should say not but and those meetings were so impactful that I actually ended up creating the podcast because of some of the things that were discussed by the people there. I was like, if our little group of whatever 8, 10, 12 people is having these conversations, how many other little groups of people across the country, across the world are having these conversations, and how many people want to have those conversations but don't know how to? And ultimately, that is what spawned detoxicity. And I have yet to answer your question. So, if there was anything that I would go back and change, it's not much, believe it or not. One thing I would do, maybe I would have done immediately, would have been to think globally and not locally. The original premise of the podcast was going to be me going around New York City with the tape recorder and talking to people. The first couple of episodes were all sort of done on location, either at someone's house or in a neutral space. And then March 2020 put a crimp in that, and I almost decided to talk to people outside of New York out of necessity. Probably the best decision I ever made, because conversations with people that I cannot sit with face to face, some of those conversations have been among the best that this podcast has ever had. So that's probably the one thing I would change. I would also probably have bought better equipment at the outset. In the last 5 years, I've gone through, I want to say, like 12 mics. Either I knock them over or I trip over them or they break or whatever. And, truthfully, I'm not even crazy about the mic that I have now, so there will probably be at least one more mic in the future. Um, but yeah, better equipment, bigger budget. I mean, I started with no budget essentially. I still don't really have a budget, um, other than whatever I get via Patreon. But yeah, those are the things that I would change. Thank you, Andrew, for your question. Would love to have you back on the show.
Mike, it's your friend Eli. First and foremost, congratulations on reaching 200 episodes. My goodness, it is such an incredible podcast full of such thoughtfulness and nuance and complexity and featuring voices that I feel like we really need to hear right now. So all the thanks to you for what you do and for providing this platform. 3 questions, kind of growing in depth. First and foremost, is there a guest that you're just dying to have on the show? Like, what is the dream guest to have on the show at this point in time? 2, are there topics that you're really interested in covering right now, or thinking about, or delving into further for the future of the podcast? And then 3, has there been a conversation that has changed the way that you view something, or shifted your viewpoint on any sort of issue in a way that felt really tangible, and something that you might have even started to change up in your day-to-day life? Thanks so much for all of this. Thank you for these 200 episodes. Love you very much. All the best.
Thank you, Eli. Another person who has not been a guest, and why haven't you, but has been a very vocal supporter of this podcast from day one. I appreciate you so much. To answer your questions, number one, I already answered that. It was asked earlier by Gregory Flynn, and I have a long list, right? And it's not written down, but I also, and maybe this is my own self-esteem talking, feel like a lot of the people that would be dream guests for me would be unattainable. And to kind of reiterate or expand upon the answer that I gave Greg earlier, I would love to have, for as far as more easily potentially attainable guests than, Barack Obama or Will Smith or even like Jumaane Williams. And I don't think Jumaane is unattainable, but we're in the middle of sort of an election season right now, so I don't know if that makes him more apt to do it or less apt to do it. But Jumaane Williams, Scott Brannon, obviously Zoran Mamdani, Brad Lander. I would love to have any of those people on the podcast. Pete Buttigieg. Yeah, there's a lot of people from entertainment, from politics, from sports. Charles Barkley, Rex Chapman. So yes, a lot of sort of more A-lister potentials. But also, I would love to have a member of my family, including my brother again. I would love to have a member of my family on the podcast. I would love to have someone I went to high school with on the podcast. And unfortunately, even though I graduated from high school with 1,200 other people, and I'm sure some of them would be interested in talking about this. I'm not really in touch with any of them, which sucks. That would be cool. I would love to have a teacher of mine, a former teacher of mine on the podcast. I would love to have a former, and I think I mentioned this when I talked to Greg, and maybe I'll edit this out later. I would love to have someone that I dated on this podcast. So lots of potential options there. Enough for another 200 episodes, I'm sure. For your second question, I I can't answer that in like an easy way. I am really trying to, and I don't know that I'm trying to foreground any issues in particular. I love having a diversity of thought on this podcast without it getting out of control. Like, you're never going to find a MAGA person on this podcast. You're never going to find anybody who's particularly politically conservative. You're not going to find anybody who's homophobic. You're not going to find anybody who is racist. But, you know, there have certainly been times when I've maybe wanted this podcast to not be so much of an echo chamber. I do love having people who are trans on the show. I love having people who maybe have an arc, right? Where they are have struggled or are struggling to beat back some of the prejudices that they have that were ingrained in them as a kid, and you know maybe they were brought up in a small town by a religious family, and either through relationships or through change of environment decided to go somewhere else, or were exposed. That is my phone, that sucks. Were exposed to a different way of thinking, a more progressive way of thinking. Obviously, I love having people who had a therapeutic journey and learned more about themselves through making the decision to go to therapy, people who came to terms with their sexuality or are exploring their sexuality or even are confused about their sexuality still, because I think that is a big thing that's not really talked about very much. I mean, I just want to keep having challenging conversations, and it's very difficult to boil down to like one specific conversation or group of conversations that I'd like to have. And to answer your third question, going back to having guests who are a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit more on the gender spectrum, right? I've always been very confident in my masculinity, or at least maybe not in masculinity in the like traditional sense. Like I don't know that I've ever felt particularly butch, but I've also never felt especially feminine. And I've had some guests on who, are maybe a little bit more on the non-binary scale, who have, had some maybe conflicting opinions about their own gender, and some people who have actually transitioned. So that is something that I don't not that I don't, well, I've never had that experience myself. I certainly empathize, but I wasn't always as open-minded. I'm sure that, God knows if social media existed when I was a teenager or when I was in my 20s, you would probably find a lot of transphobia and a lot of homophobia, very internalized, obviously, on the homophobia part. That, I think a lot of Gen X is very grateful that things like social media did not exist when we were young people, because, a lot of us have had to grow into our open minds, right? So I can't think of one specific conversation that has caused me to change a behavior. I love the fact that so many of the men that I've talked to have talked about things like meditation, mindfulness. Those are practices that I'm still working on, and I've certainly taken bits and pieces from people that I've spoken to and applied it to myself. I've certainly read a handful of books based on conversations that I've had on this podcast. So it's kind of a mixture of things without it being one specific thing. Again, I feel like I'm rambling and maybe I haven't completely answered your questions, but I guess I see you in person on a regular basis, so you'll let me know if I did the trick or not. And also, Eli, you should be on this show.
Congratulations on 5 years and 200 episodes of putting out a podcast. That's amazing. And actually my question is, people get a lot of flack these days. There's a lot of jokes going around about how everybody and their brother has a podcast and how easy it is. But I'm curious for you, what's it actually like to make a podcast, host a podcast, interview people? What do you wish people knew about this for you? I'm curious how your own personal motivations for creating the podcast and keeping it up after 200 episodes have changed over the last 5 years. I'm curious if after 200 episodes and 5 years of doing this, if there are like nuggets of wisdom or parts of conversations that just sort of tumble around in your brain and come back to you like all the time as you're moving through life and, figuring it out like the rest of us.
And thank you, Finn, for providing those questions. That is Finn, who is the host of a podcast called Normalizing Non-Monogamy. It is a fantastic podcast. I've been on it. He has been on this one. And a little piece that I cut off was him uh, offering his services to come back. And 100% Finn, you will be coming back to the podcast. He also asked three questions and split them up in a way that there were three separate questions, but I'm just going to answer them all together in one fell swoop. Your first question was about a thing that I wish people knew about putting together a podcast. And honestly, it is not as easy as some people may think it is. And look, every podcast is different. Some people just want to talk into a microphone and there's not a whole lot of forethought behind it. And I've done podcasts like that, and that's fun. This one requires uh, more research beforehand. If I'm talking to somebody that I don't really know, or even if I'm talking to somebody that I do know, because I have my guests fill out a little questionnaire with some passion points, pain points, that kind of thing. So there's prep work. There's constantly having to be thinking about the conversation as it's happening. Then there's an editing process, then there's a summarization process, and it is not easy. I would like to think that over the last 5 years, I've gotten better at all of the different components that are part of the process, but it still can be a bit time consuming. So that the biggest misconception is just that you just talk into a microphone and put it out in the world, and some people do that, and that's fine. I'm not one of those people. Um, the second question was, if I remember it correctly, um, if I carry any nuggets of wisdom with me from previous guests. And I can't speak to specifics, but I am in fairly regular contact with quite a few of my former guests. These are people who I go have drinks with, have coffee with. These are people who come to my house and hang out. And the conversations that I have as part of the podcast are always somewhere floating around in the periphery, right? They're always present when I'm interacting with this person because in most of these cases, I have interviewed these people in a very vulnerable state, which is not necessarily equating to the state that we're in when we're sitting in a bar having a drink. You know what I'm saying? So kind of just it adds to the overall picture. Like it gives me extra color, extra context in all of my interactions with the people that I talk to subsequent to me talking to them. And I'm gonna have to listen to your thing again because I forgot what the other question was. Third, I'm answering these in reverse order, kind of. How have my personal motivations changed since starting the podcast? I honestly don't think they've changed much. Um, I have said it many times before. The fact that other people get something out of this podcast is secondary to me getting something out of this podcast. The main reason I keep doing this is because I find people fascinating and I learn something from every single person that I speak to, whether it's a conversation that got shit canned or a conversation that sits with me forever and ever, or someone I've had a third or fourth conversation with. The knowledge and the empathy and the experience I get of other people's lives through having these conversations with people and having deep conversations with people, right? We're not talking about the weather or the game on TV or anything like that. These are deep, deep conversations. It just broadens my toolkit, broadens my worldview. I think makes me a more empathetic, more intelligent person. And I love that I get to go to school and I get to learn, and then you all get to learn as well as you listen. So it also just makes me feel like I'm putting something worthy into the world. I think, you know, each of us has a debt to pay for being here, right? And we can put good stuff into the universe, and hopefully this podcast exists long after I'm gone, or in previously recorded episodes, and people that I will never get the chance to meet in person are hearing these conversations and getting something out of them. So again, this is me repaying back the debt I owe to the world for letting me breathe its air. Finn, thank you again for submitting multiple questions, and thank you for the work that you do with the Normalizing Non-Monogamy podcast and all of the other stuff that you and your partner Emma do. It is fantastic stuff. So when I solicited questions for this particular episode, I asked the folks who are contributing on Instagram and via email to send me a voice note. Some people decided to not send me a voice note and send their questions via email. So I'm just going to answer a couple of final questions that I got via email. And this question actually came from two people. It came from my friend Brian Dunn and my friend Sammy Pisano. Brian has been on the podcast. Actually, Brian and Sammy have both been on the podcast before. Sammy's been on it twice. And their question is, let's see how I can word this properly. Basically, what conversations are still missing in the cultural dialogue around masculinity? That was Sammy's question. What's the topic you're surprised has not come up? Which it was Brian's question. And I've been thinking about this today. And one thing, so I can answer these as two separate questions, or I can answer these as one question. My combined answer is that I'm not sure if people that are not men understand that podcasts like this can be for them as well. We all need each other, right? And I think when we talk about things like racism or homophobia or gender equality, feminism, we all need each other to progress, right? Like black folks need non-black folks. Queer folks need straight folks. Uh, Women need men. Men need women. Non-binary people, so on and so forth. So these conversations are not just for men. The tagline of the podcast is about men by men for everyone. I struggle, and I consider myself a feminist. I struggle with the version of feminism that basically is women replicating patriarchal norms. That is not feminism. A former friend of mine named Nissa Greenberg once used a phrase called queering the patriarchy, which ultimately I think is really the path forward. And it is taking this patriarchal structure that we have been socialized into, and not just men have been socialized into this, all genders have been socialized into this, and completely dismantling it. And that means equality. It doesn't mean anybody being superior to anybody. It means everybody getting along because we're all on the same level. And I think that being inclusive of all is really missing from every progressive conversation that there is to be had. And there needs to be more of it. Um, I, let's see. Huh. And I don't know that there are other conversations that are missing in the cultural dialogue that I can think of off the top of my head that have not been covered, at least in one episode of this podcast. I think we've really run the gamut of a lot of stuff. One thing that's kind of a personal passion point slash pain point for me is the queering of sexuality, and the black and white that we tend to give everything, like gay or straight, male or female, black or white, when the reality, and we really need to just, because this is so like basic, and we still don't understand it. The majority of our experiences as people lie somewhere between one pole and the other pole. It needs to be an and as opposed to one or the other. And all of these things, all of these identities can be fluid over, the course of time. And I would love if we all really stepped back and looked at ourselves and looked at each other and understood the level of fluidity that should be, and I think if we stripped away all the bullshit, would be part of all of our lives. So that's me flipping onto a soapbox and flipping right back off of. Um, let's see, what's another question here? Um, if you were, oh, Brian asked this question. If you were to launch a companion podcast for other gender identities, who would you like to see host? Um, I think that there are a lot of podcasts run by women that do the same thing that I'm trying to do for women. Um, my friend Dirty Lola, I think, would be an amazing podcast host. She co-hosted the Life on the Swing Set podcast with me and Dylan Thomas and Cooper S. Beckett. Um, and I just think that she kind of reminds me of Michelle Buteau, and I'm not really sure why. Um, but she is so intelligent and very opinionated, and very curious, and also very like welcoming. So I would love to see her host a podcast regularly, because I think there'd be some interesting, uncomfortable conversations. But I think this podcast also has some interesting, uncomfortable conversations, and I think she'd do a fantastic job. So I'm throwing my hat in the ring for Dirty Lola to start her own podcast. Lola, if you're listening, let's make something happen. You make something happen. You don't need me. You're cottage industry all to yourself. But she would be my vote. And just in the sort of celebrity world, I think there are so many people that would do a good job at something like this. I think Michelle Obama does something similar. There are so many amazing women that are doing this work, and are also doing this work not just for women, but for other genders as well. So hats off to you. I appreciate you for what you do. So when I started this podcast back in 2020, I had absolutely no clue that I'd still be doing this 200 episodes later and 5 years later, and here we are. And I'm so grateful to everyone that listens to the podcast, everyone that has reached out to me IRL or on social media, telling me that they've gotten something out of a particular episode or out of multiple episodes. And I thank the guests, everyone who has opened themselves up, been vulnerable, been honest, been giving of themselves, and talked about heavy shit. And look, someone recently was like, "Yeah, your podcast is a heavy listen," and I agree. There are parts of it that are heavy, but I think we do it with a lot of warmth, with laughter. There are some conversations that I have, or at least portions of some conversations that are like laugh out loud funny. I do interview quite a few comedians, and all I ask is that uh, if you are a fan of the podcast, please keep supporting it. I have a Patreon, tinyurl.com. Actually, no, it's not tinyurl. It's bit.ly. So bit.ly/detoxpod plus. You can subscribe for as little as $3 a month, and you get episodes early. Tell your friends. Let people know about this podcast. If you would like to be interviewed, or you know somebody who wants to be interviewed for the podcast, or would be a good person to be interviewed for the podcast, let me know. I'm reachable via social media. All this stuff is already in like the outro and stuff. So why am I repeating it? I don't know. But thank you again for the last 5 years, for the last 200 episodes. There's more to come. Very immediately down the pike, we have some fantastic conversations, and I look forward to even more beyond that. So keep it locked. I really, really appreciate you. And we're going to go out with one final question, courtesy of two-time guest John Hill.
Hey, Mike. John Hill here. Curious how the coaching journey is going for you, and if you've learned anything about yourself by coaching others.
So one of the many things that this podcast has led me to is a career as a coach. I signed up for some classes. That was my 2023 New Year's resolution. Signed up for some classes, got my certification towards the end of 2023, opened my own business at the start of 2024. Mike Joseph Coaching is an actual thing. I have had a couple of clients. over the year and a half or so that the business has been open. I can't say that I've promoted it too much. I've kept it sort of low to the ground, mainly because I also have a regular 40-hour-a-week job, and it's really hard to balance that. There seems to never be enough hours in a day. I'm also trying to make sure that I'm always in the right head for coaching. The election and the inauguration threw me back a bit, and I kind of left that part of the business alone for a little while I made the adjustments that I needed to make to whatever this new normal is. And now I feel like I can do it again. And so I'm slowly poking my head back into that world and measuring my bandwidth. The clients that I have worked with have all been great. It has been a really, really cool experience to just be able to listen and offer insight to people. That's kind of part of what this podcast is about, and part of what I try to do on a regular basis as a friend and as a human. Getting paid for it isn't a bad thing. Um, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. I certainly could probably use another business class or two, and we'll see what happens with time. It wasn't a project that I only wanted to do for the first couple of months and then abandoned. This is going to be some long tail stuff, and we're going to see how things go. I'm also surrounded by a bunch of great coaches. Shout out to Greg Flynn and Tom Gentry, both of whom I've had the pleasure of interviewing for this podcast, and following them for guidance as well. So, to answer your question, it's definitely still a thing. We're working to make it bigger and better, and hopefully that, along with the podcast, will continue to grow. Thanks, John. I appreciate you so much. And everybody, thank you for listening, and we'll see you with the regular episode very soon, 201. Thanks, all.